The typical way of teaching maths in schools has brought most of us to the conclusion that mathematics is both difficult and irrelevant to our daily lives. And yet our brains are hardwired to find mathematical relationships beautiful, from self-repeating structures and geometric patterns to spirals, symmetry, fractals, but nowhere is it more evident than with our innate appreciation of music. This series has dealt so far with what notes are and how you make them, and how any note produced by an instrument is actually a sum of sine waves, with a fundamental, which is the lowest frequency and the one that we hear as being the note, and then a series of harmonics, which are integer multiples of that fundamental, and it's their relative strengths that give that note its characteristic sound, or timbre. But what happens if you have two notes playing at the same time? Well, the resulting sound is described as having consonance, how in tune it might be, or dissonance, how out of tune it sounds. And the general rule is the simpler the mathematical relationship between the fundamental frequencies of those two notes, the more in tune they will sound. So let's get one note going in the left channel of your headphones and another in the right. And at the moment they're the same note, so you can see both harmonics are lining up exactly. And I'll number those harmonics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, so you can keep track of them. Because now I'm going to move the orange note up in frequency, so its first harmonic, the fundamental, lines up with harmonic number 2 of the blue note. By lining up harmonics 2 and 1, we've made the orange note 2 over 1, or twice the frequency. And that is the most consonant of relationships that any two different notes can possibly have. So much so that they actually sound like the same note. This happens every time you double or halve the frequency. You end up with the same note again. So it makes sense to think of movement in frequency as going around a circle, where each time you double the frequency you end up back at the same point on that circle. And it's worth remembering that movement on that circle corresponds to multiplying or dividing, not adding or subtracting. So let's go further then and line up harmonic 2 of one note with harmonic 3 of the other. That gives the next most consonant interval, which is a relationship of 3 over 2. This has a lot of harmonics lining up and has a very consonant sound. Great, now line up harmonics 3 and 4, and you get another very consonant sound with a relationship of 4 over 3. Lining up harmonics 4 and 5, and you get a ratio of 5 over 4, which is less consonant than the others, but it still sounds really nice. So we're filling up the circle with notes now, but unless all you want to play is the opening riff of Birdland, we are going to need more notes. And we can get them just using the notes we've got so far, i.e. the ratios of 2s, 3s and 5s. So for example, you can do the 3 over 2 ratio twice and get 9 over 4. And then you can make that 9 over 8 without changing the note, right? Because it's just halving the frequency. So we get this same ratio by lining up harmonics 9 and 8. Combining the 4 over 3 ratio with the 5 over 4 gives 5 over 3, lining up the 5th harmonic with the 3rd. And finally, combining 3 over 2 with 5 over 4 gives 15 over 8. Not particularly consonant, but very useful. So now we've filled up this circle quite nicely. There are a few places where there are notes closer together than others, but generally speaking, it's fairly well spaced out around the circle. So let's play them all one after the other and hear how they sound. Well, I'm sure you've heard that sound before.
Doe, a deer, a female deer.
All of those notes were created using just combinations of the first 3 prime numbers, 2, 3 and 5. And the simpler the ratio that you get in the end, the more in tune that note sounds with the original note that you started with. Great, let's give ourselves a pat on the back and give these new notes we've found some names. Let's be as confusing as possible and number them from 1 to 7 around the circle. That way, the one that's the 3rd note is the one that lined up with the 5th harmonic, and the one that's the 5th note lines up with the 3rd harmonic. Well, it's not the best system, but it's the one we've got. Anyway, we're done now, right? Well, no, because there are other ratios of 2s and 3s and 5s we could have used. And in fact, anytime we moved a note up in frequency to line up 2 harmonics, we could have easily moved it down. and that makes another interval, which is the inverse of the one we had before, which is the same as mirroring it on this circle to the other side. That fills in all the gaps except one, and for now I'll grab this little ratio here, which looks about the right size, and add it on to this one. Alright, now we've got 12 notes around the circle, and they're really evenly spaced too. So should we scrap that whole 1st to 7th thing and go with 1st to 12th instead? Nah. Let's stick with 1st to 7th and just call those ones we first found the pretty versions of the notes, or the happy versions, nice versions. Major. Let's call them the major versions of those notes. And then the ones we found by reflecting or inverting the ratios, call them the minor versions of those notes. So what about this weird monstrosity in the middle, the ratio of 64/45? Those numbers are so big that it's bound to have a really dissonant sound and has no place in pure beautiful music. Let's just call it an augmented 4th for now, seeing as the 4th didn't get to have a minor version, but neither did the 5th. All right, let's call it a diminished 5th then. It doesn't really matter whatever we call it because no one's ever going to use it. So all of these notes aren't at fixed frequencies. They are called intervals. They are a relationship between that note and another one, in this case the one that's sitting at the top of the circle, but we can move them all around and the interval stays the same. Okay, beautiful. So now we're done? Well, in India, they kept going with ratios of 2s, 3s and 5s and found 10 more useful notes. But curiously enough, they also decided to name them based on those first 7, calling them the pure notes or Shuddha Swar. And the other intervals were named as some type of variation on those notes. And this 22 note system was whittled down from an initial pool of 66 intervals or Shrutis. So when we in the West stopped at 12 intervals, it was just a line drawn in the sand based on the fact that they were all fairly evenly spaced out and they sounded quite good with each other. But what about lining up other harmonics that have higher prime factors, so 7 and 11 and things like that? And then there's all the infinite range of frequencies that are between these ratios too. Well, they're all useful to some extent, and music of some cultures uses a bunch of them all the time. But if you're not used to them, they can sound quite dissonant. You get a curious thing that happens too when you have harmonics that almost line up but don't quite, and that's called a beat frequency. If I line up 2 sine waves that are at slightly different frequencies, one will fall behind over time and eventually be out of phase, and then not long after that will be in phase again. And the result is constructive and destructive interference, heard as a loud soft pulsing of that note. And that can sound really grating and dissonant, especially if it's happening in one of the lower harmonics. If it's happening in one of the really high ones, it can go largely unnoticed. It's what a violin player is listening for when they're tuning. As they play 2 strings simultaneously, the 3rd harmonic, or the 5th, is going to be pulsing if it's out of tune, and then as you get it in tune, that pulse will gradually slow down and stop. So, armed with our 12 notes derived from mathematically pure and beautiful ratios, we're ready to make music, right? Well, there are some problems associated with this system. These notes might sound beautiful compared with this note, but if you want to use, say, this one as the reference, now we get all sorts of dissonances and bad sounding intervals, sometimes called wolf intervals. The history of music is littered with all sorts of different ways of trying to address this problem, and they normally involve nudging some or all of these intervals around. And that tempering of the intervals, and then eventually leading to what's now called 12-tone equal temperament, is the subject of the next episode. But that's all for now. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I make a video every week and YouTube thinks this one might be of interest to you. Big thanks to all of my supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, the link is in the description. And to all of you, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.